Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar on encryption export controls. To kick things off, I just want to give you a bit of information about myself, and I will also give you some insight into what we will be doing in today's webinar. So for those of you, I think many of you on the call have been to my webinars in the past. I do the encryption export controls basic training and more advanced training pretty much every year. So this will be the 2020 version of my encryption export controls update. I wear a couple of different hats, probably like many of you. I'm a consultant, so I work with companies that have various questions on exporting military items, commercial items, dual use items, that sort of range of activities. I also do auditing. So I go to companies and I try to figure out what they have done, get a chance to see how things work in real life, make recommendations on what could be improved, what's overkill, what's reasonable, best practices, etc. And then the last hat is the trainer hat. So today I have my trainer hat on. And I will try to give you as much information as I can very quickly, because as you know, I think there's a lot of experienced people on this call in export controls and even in encryption export controls. And those of you who have been around it know that it is not an easy topic. And obviously we can't cover it all in 30 minutes. So my approach here is to give you some information on what has changed in the past year and what we can look forward to changing in the next coming year. I'll go through each of the changes, and before sort of getting into the details, I just want to give you kind of a lay of the land. And we'll talk about what the changes and what the regulations mean in today's compliance environment. And then introduce you to my three-part training series, which again, I believe that many of you on the call have taken one or more of these classes before. But for those of you who are new to me or new to the topic, I will spend some time kind of outlining what we do and how we do it. And, you know, in the event that it's something that you want to pursue yourself, or you may have some people in your organization who might be able to take advantage of this as well. Okay, so enough about me. I know that from looking at the list, which is over 200 people I think are on today, we have a bunch of different industries represented. So we have the electronics industry, semiconductor manufacturing, we've got computer and telecom manufacturers and service providers. We have quite a few people from the government labs and universities. And we have some consultants and lawyers. So consultants like me and legal practitioners who work with companies who have export control related issues. So again, I know just from a first glance, some of you are very experienced, probably most of you are experienced. And I mentioned that because I will kind of jump right into things. And I know we try not to use acronyms, but we can't avoid it really in this type of talk. So I'm pretty sure that you know what BIS, DOC, CCL, EAR, ITAR, I mean, just list all those crazy things that we use, the language that we use to talk about export controls. So again, I mentioned like way at the beginning when we were just kind of getting ready to sign on, we're doing these virtual training sessions, obviously in light of the fact that we're limited in terms of travel, and so the live seminars that we typically do are going to be on hold for a while in light of COVID. So we want to be able to sort of maximize our access to people, maximize our service offerings and the platform that we use. So I'll invite you to ask some, you know, to provide feedback at the end of the program. At this point, if you want to provide feedback during the program, you can enter any kind of comment in the chat. We'll also try to take some questions at the end. Okay, so we will talk about the control list changes, and we'll talk about a couple other possible changes to the EAR outside of the control list that affect encryption exports. Talk a little bit about what we might see in the next year, and then really just try to discuss, you know, what does this mean in terms of compliance? Has anything changed in compliance the rules change marginally. Usually your compliance plan doesn't really have to change that much. But that's just something I want to kind of wrap up the discussion on. Okay, so I'm a visual learner, and whenever I'm trying to figure something out, I draw diagrams to help me. And so I came up with a new Venn diagram for your to hopefully help explain kind of where we are today, because today we are in a challenging position in so many ways. We are being challenged, but if you read my bio, which is at the end, you understand how long I've been doing this. So it's like about 30 years. And I will say that at no time in the past 30 years has there been a consistent stream of export control news in the major newspapers, and not only the major newspapers, but the cable news networks and regular television news. It is just, a day doesn't go by where we don't talk about sanctions, about companies that we don't want to, that the US government has issues with. We have all sorts of drama going on right now, which I'll explain in a minute. So it's just, the environment has changed a lot. So what I wanted to capture in this Venn diagram is where we're at. Some of these news things seem like they're related to export controls. Some of them are, some of them aren't. So today, what we're going to do is talk about the EAR, which is Export Administration Regulations, that it's administered by the Bureau of Industry and Security, which is part of the Department of Commerce. Now, aside from saying what the acronyms are, that's significant, and I will get back to that in a second. So we're going to talk about the control list categories, Category 5, Part 1 and 2, primarily Part 2, which is the information security section. The regulations that exist, the EAR, exists because of the Export Control Reform Act, which is the law that was passed fairly recently, that where all the export control rules are, and then by looking at the law, the agencies then write regulations and so forth. A lot of the changes in the Category 5, Part 1 and 2, so that is changes in the Commerce Control List, are driven by the Wassenaar arrangement. So again, those of you who have done this for a long time know Wassenaar is a group of countries that have similar interests in terms of export controls. So every year, Wassenaar arrangement countries congregate, and they'd say, okay, we should add this to our control lists. We should take this off. We should modify this language or that language. And then every year, there's a plenary where there's a decision document that comes out, and then all of the countries have to go back to their own governments and promulgate regulations to implement the changes that were made in the plenary. Wassenaar is also looking at some emerging technologies. So the Export Control Reform Act says you have to get export controls on emerging technologies that have national security implications. And so that's kind of the ecosystem we're in. Okay, now, I'm sure most of you on the call, I would probably bet the 99% of the people know about the sanctions that have been placed on Huawei entities. So Huawei, again, is a very, very large telecommunications company that makes cell phones, makes network infrastructure equipment, really dominates a lot of the cell phone environment and is moving toward the 5G. And the US has had a war with Huawei over the past couple of years. And that's why I put that in big red, because it's, for all of you on the call, I would say, aside from maybe the government labs and the consultants at lawyers, I think everyone else probably knows about the Huawei sanctions, because Huawei was put on the entity list. You cannot, if you're a US person, or if you're in the US, export a lot of things to Huawei. third-party products that come outside, that are made outside of the US, but based on US origin technology or components. Really, we're not going to go into all that crazy Huawei stuff, but that is something that we've had to deal with that's relatively new within the past year or two. Another interest that the US government has is on supply chain and products that come into the US that get implemented in networks that are relied upon by government agencies, by commercial companies, and in some cases, maybe even military, US military. So the Trump administration put out an executive order back at the beginning of last year. It was a proposed, there was an executive order, and then there were some rules proposed later, which basically say you can't buy equipment and install it in the network if it comes from a country where we have national security, a country with national security controls, or specific companies. And so that is also the Department of Commerce, but it's not the BIS. Okay, so the what we call the ICTS now, the Information Communications Technology and Services rules, they are being handled right now by the Secretary of Commerce. So there's an intersection there between Huawei, because Huawei is considered to be a threat because of hardware and software that runs on certain networks. On the other side, there's also a concern, and it's more of data privacy and human rights. So again, if you read the papers, you know that there's been some heavy duty action on two Chinese companies and their apps that are available and used worldwide. One is TikTok and one is WeChat. I know if you have any kids that are under the age, or I don't know, 20, 30, whatever, know all about TikTok. I just learned about it. I didn't really know. But the other app is WeChat, which is an app that's manufactured by the Chinese company Tencent. And there's been daily battles on that. There was an executive order that was put out 45 days ago that said these two entities, these two products are going, US companies can't buy them, or no one could use them, et cetera. There was sort of a big, it was trying to, the US government was trying to shut down the two services, TikTok and WeChat. Over the next 45 days, there was some horse trading and negotiations. Bottom line is the order came in on Friday last week that US couldn't use TikTok or WeChat inside the US. That was Friday afternoon, and by Monday morning, there was a court injunction against that taking place. So crazy times, intersecting agencies, overlapping concerns. That's kind of the crazy world that we're in today. Just a couple things to note that I know on the call today, we have people from outside of the United States. So people that are manufacturing items outside the United States whose customer is Huawei or Huawei related entities, or people that are providing services to Huawei related entities, have to deal with meaning the US sanctions on Huawei. And we're certainly not going to go into that because it's several hours of training. But I just wanted to acknowledge that we have companies on the call with interest in this area that aren't necessarily US companies. Okay, so good news, bad news. I don't know what you want first. I'll give you the bad news first. The bad news is that I didn't schedule this for 30 minutes because I was only going to tell you that the export controls on encryption are completely gone. I think, and that probably is what crossed a few people's minds when they know all about how complicated encryption controls are. Why is she only talking for 30 minutes? Maybe it's because all the controls are gone. Well, I'm sorry. That's not going to happen. So, but the good news is that there really are, in the past year, there's been some marginal changes that on the whole, I think are really going to help companies and make the process of compliance a little bit more, less burdensome. And I'll tell you why, obviously. But I do think that on the whole, we have some changes that are positive. We also know, I think, because I've heard this said from Department of Commerce officials and others, that there's no changes that are going to happen to the regulations in the foreseeable future. So that while that's bad because they're horrible and hard to deal with and just confusing, and wouldn't it be nice to kind of rewrite them all and do that? That's not going to happen. But if you understand what the rules are now, and if you've created processes around those rules, then you know that you're not going to have to make big changes to that as time goes on this year or next year, I guess, in 2021. I think having stability has its advantages because of the fact that this is such a hard area. And if you're trying to work with people, you don't want to keep going back to them, telling them, oh yeah, that was a rule last week, but this is the rule now, et cetera. So there's basically these three topics, and there was two different Federal Register notices that I'm going to talk about in more detail. Now, it just so happens that these three changes that I'm going to talk about were changes that were agreed to at Wassenaar. So remember when I was doing the pie chart, the Venn diagram, we talked about Wassenaar, et cetera. And so the changes that we'll discuss came out of multilateral agreements there. Now, the bad thing about Wassenaar controls and changes that are made to the US regulations to implement Wassenaar decisions is that they come out in final rule. So one day you have no control on your products, and the next day you have a rule that says you have a control now. There's no comment period. There's no warning. The rule is a final rule. And so, that's a little bit disconcerting, I think, for some people, because you just don't have time to comment on the language. And again, multinational companies or companies outside of the United States that follow this, for example, the European Union, they make changes to European Union regulations after Wassenaar plenaries, and other countries like the UK and Singapore, et cetera, companies who have Wassenaar-like control regimes nationally, they will perhaps get their implementing regulations finished before the US does. Okay, so crypto activation. Now this was put in the Federal Register on 9/11, and that was a couple of days ago, or last week, I guess. So the concept of crypto activation is not new. We have, for those of you, again, who are in the business, who have been doing this a long time, might remember the dormant cryptography, the ancillary cryptography, the note 4, and then not note 4, all these crazy things. But as a practical matter, okay, so I've had situations in the past, several years where a company will manufacture an appliance, for example, and the appliance will have a multitude of functionalities, some including encryption, some not. If the functionality, if you don't have to have the cryptography piece activated, then there's a business reason why you might want to have one appliance, for example, in the hardware world, one appliance that does 4 things, one of which includes encryption. Maybe you can ship it to customers because they want the functionality except the cryptography. So if you can turn it off, if you can deactivate it, then you're able to say that your product is not caught in Category 5 Part 2, and then you don't need to be concerned with license exceptions or figuring out if you have a licensing requirement. You would only have a concern if the customer, for example, wanted the fourth piece of functionality that used encryption. They would have to get a license key or something to enable that functionality in an appliance. Then that license key then would carry the designation for Category 5 Part 2. So we know that, or I know, because I've done a lot of classifications on behalf of clients before, that if you submitted a CCAT, so that's the the classification formal request to the Department of Commerce, you could put on your line items, this is appliance A, it has no encryption when it's not activated, and so the ECCN is usually like EAR 99 or 5A991, for example, for telecom. And then the next line item would be the key, the cryptographic enabling device. It doesn't have to be hardware, it's usually software. And that carries the classification in Category 5 Part 2. So you might have it as 5A002 for the key, when the box itself with the functionality disabled is 5A991, for example. So the concept of crypto activation has been out there for years, and so it's a change. And again, it came out of Wassenaar. Basically, the language changed, and it made it more specific, and so that companies who didn't quite understand it, they're now in the regulations a lot more guidance and a lot more clarity about having something activated versus deactivated and what that means. And there's also been some conforming changes to the 5E002. Another change that was something that was not new to us in the industry who have done classification work for products that use encryption, but not for its primary purpose. For those of you who remember way back when, there was an acknowledgement by BIS that certain computerized equipment fell within Category 5 Part 2 just because of the fact that encryption was used to transmit information, but it wasn't an information security product. It was really ancillary to the functioning and the primary purpose of the equipment. So that concept got translated into what we used to call Note 4. And then we further had a removal of Note 4 and some new language. So to make a long story short, the new control list change has a decontrol note for products that are specially designed for a connected civil industry application. And this is something that covers a lot of the IoT, a lot of the Internet of Things applications. So there is this new decontrol note, and I think it's very helpful because it does make some specific references. I've actually copied the actual language from the reg in this slide. So you will have a lot more specificity and you will have an actual part of the regulations in Category 5 Part 2 where it actually reads this way. So again, this is a policy that the US has had. There has been language similar to this in the website, on the BIS website, and it kind of gets moved around. So it's always a challenge to find where it actually says this. So again, I think that this covers a lot of automated equipment. It covers a lot of utilities, some power stations, oil and gas. You could really fit a lot of uses. of equipment that could take advantage of this decontrol node. Okay, our next change is one that was actually it was actually published by the US in May of last year. And this relates to post-quantum cryptography. And it was also agreed to at the Wassenaar 2018 plenary. And the reason why I think it's significant is because at the same time, so let me back up a little bit. So there's something called a quantum computer or quantum computing, which uses physics to make massively powerful computer chips. And so if you have a massively powerful computer that uses quantum technologies, you're able to do a lot of data crunching, 1,000,000 times faster than you can do now. And so that makes cryptographic algorithms that are standard be less secure. So that's why there's a concern about quantum computing and quantum cryptography. And so what's happened in the Wassenaar sort of realm of Wassenaar decision making was a affirmation that quantum computing might weaken the security that's usually used by people, and that there's some specific algorithms, techniques that if you use the post-quantum cryptography capabilities using the algorithms, you can break standard algorithms quickly. And that, that's not a good thing from the US and from the other countries' perspective. So as part of the rule that came into place, again, it was in May of 2019, and it was a final rule because it was part of Wassenaar, and it also was a emerging technologies thing, but we don't need to really go into detail about that. But kind of it has a couple of implications. So there's a new language that talked about described security algorithms, and those are basically standard algorithms that probably most everyone on the call is familiar with. So that's automated, AES, Advanced Encryption Standard, Triple DES, some of these sort of SSL type algorithms, those are all standard. But there's new algorithms that are in play because they're the ones that can be used on quantum computers, or they can be ultimately destined for quantum computing, and that is something that's emerging right now. So the actual whether this exists in reality, we don't know, but there's specific algorithms that have been established that are now in 5A002. So there's no question that if you have something that uses those algorithms, then that would be something new that was controlled. This is significant for maybe not all of you, but for the universities and the government labs that do actually push the envelope on this stuff. This is where you have an issue that I would direct, government and academic institutions to just go and find out if this kind of stuff is happening at the university level. And now at the research level. So this doesn't change our fundamental research and all that. So we're not really going there. But my advice is for people that, find out if this kind of activity is going on in their universities or their government labs. In addition, the chips that are made that go into quantum computers are now being developed by the major chip manufacturers and the other players in the computing field and in the services field. So Google and Microsoft and Intel and all the big name companies are developing in an experimental way this type of stuff. So from a compliance standpoint, you have to kind of look at category 3 as well, semiconductors and so forth. Okay. Okay, so what are we going to expect in the future? we are going to see perhaps an addition of something to 5A004. Now, we've talked a lot about Category 5, Part 2. We're talking about 5A 002, 5D002. Haven't gotten into too much more specificity with regard to what that's going to look like. But basically, the change to 5A004 is going to be technologies that can be used to basically break into computers and get the data out of them without their owners knowing. And so that is something that is going to be an issue potentially, but I don't think it's going to be a widespread issue. Hopefully that will come out sometime in the next 5 to 10 months. Okay, so the regulations are very complex, and even the Department of Commerce agrees they're so complex, but there's no appetite to fix them, and that's unfortunate because we all understand how to deal with this, but we want to we wish that it was better. We wish that it was easier. We wish that there was less things controlled. One of the things that I wanted to mention as far as compliance goes, the Commerce Department office that deals with the classifications on Category 5 Part 2 is extremely short-staffed. And so if you submit something that can be actually self-classified, then you're just going to have to wait forever, literally forever, to get it done. And the Commerce Department also recommends that this is not good. So I would just suggest that you be very judicious in what you do submit for classification, and really only submit those things that are either borderline or specifically require classification review. All right, so we've run into our time here. I did want to just briefly go over the 3 upcoming webinars that we have. The basics webinar will be at the end of this month on September 30th. So that webinar will feature all of the nuts and bolts. So we're going to talk about classification, we talk about licensing requirements, we talk about license exception ENC, we talk about CCATs, we talk about technical basics, how to figure out if something's mass market, what's B2 and what's not. So that's our first program that goes over all that stuff. The second webinar that will be held a month later is our DIY encryption class. And what we do there is we actually create classification questionnaires, and we go through, and all the participants get the copy of the questionnaire, and that I've developed, and we talk about how to tailor it to your needs. And so that's a very hands-on nuts and bolts on classification really only. The last webinar, the one that will be in November, is an advanced class. And what we do in that class is it's more interactive. We have scenarios that are either supplied by the attendees or ones that I make up. And there's all sorts of exercises, and it's a very good program, but again, it's an advanced one. You have to have you have to understand the rules really well, and the classification and licensing issues, in order to take advantage of that. So lastly, if you need any help, or if you have any suggestions or comments or questions, if you would let us know, you can reach us at exportcontrolwebinars.com. Yes. So I would like to hear the good, the bad, any suggestions of other topics not relating to encryption that you'd like to hear. I typically do one on record keeping, product classification generally, and auditing. So if there's a topic that you'd like to see us do, please let us know. Okay, so again, thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to see you at one of the future webinars that we have. And again, we look forward to your comments, questions, likes, dislikes, and so forth. So thanks very much for your attendance today, and we'll see you next time.